The night my daughter-in-law told me to leave before dinner started, I didn't argue. I just nodded. I didn't know that in 20 minutes I'd be the reason her husband's boss stopped his own speech. Mid-sentence. In front of 200 people. Didn't know my son was about to learn something about me he'd never known. Something I buried on purpose. 22 years ago, all I knew was this. I didn't belong in that ballroom. Victoria had made sure of that. 3 times. Politely. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the suit hanging in my closet for 20 years, and the man who finally had a reason to wear it. I'm 69, 43 years an electrician. My hands still remember every wire they ever touched. My son Daniel called on a Tuesday. "Dad, you have to come," he said. "The firm's Gala." I hesitated. I always do. His wife comes from old money. She's never once raised her voice at me. She doesn't need to. Polite people have other ways of cutting. I said yes anyway. For Daniel. That night, I laid the suit across the bed and ironed it slowly, the way my wife used to before every occasion. That scared me. I bought it for her retirement dinner, the year before she passed. I remember standing in the store telling the tailor I'd probably never wear it again after that night. I was wrong twice now. I held the jacket up to the light. Ran my thumb along the seam. Wondered if it still fit the way it used to before my shoulders started rounding forward from 4 decades of looking down at circuit boxes instead of up at anything else. It fit. Mostly. I thought about her while. I buttoned it, about how she would have fixed my collar without asking, the way she always did, and told me I looked handsome whether or not it was true. Before I left, I opened my old toolbox out of habit, just to check the latch, the way I do every time I leave the house, even when I'm not bringing it with me. On top sat a wire cutter older than my son. I don't know why I picked it up. I don't know why I held it a moment too long. I closed the box. Remember, that box. It matters later. The ballroom was built to make ordinary men feel small. Chandeliers, a live orchestra, judges, executives, men who talked about mergers the way I used to talk about circuit breakers. I stood near the wall and felt every eye slide past me. "What firm are you with?" a man in Navy asked, already shaking my hand before I'd answered. "I'm Daniel's father." Ah. His eyes were already gone. "That's nice," a woman asked next, champagne glued to her hand. "So, what field are you in?" I used to be an electrician. Her smile didn't move. Her attention already had. A third man, older, with a firm grip, asked if I'd wired the ballroom myself. He meant it kindly, I think. It didn't feel that way. A fourth conversation started and ended in the time it takes to set down a drink. A woman asked what brought me to the Gala. I said, "My son worked there." She said, "How nice," and turned before I finished the sentence. I stopped counting after that. I watched Daniel work the room instead. Easy laugh. Quick hand on every shoulder. A man completely at home in a place that had made me feel like a stranger within the first 10 minutes. I thought about the nights I missed watching him become that man. The nights I came home past midnight, smelling like copper and sawdust, too tired to ask about his day. The Saturdays I spent under someone else's house instead of at his games, fixing emergency service calls that never seemed to happen on weekdays. The tuition payments that appeared in his account every semester, money he assumed came from scholarships and loans, never asking where the difference actually came from. A father isn't supposed to keep score. But standing there, invisible in my own son's success, I was starting to wonder if anyone was keeping mine. Victoria found me at the bar. Her voice never rises. It doesn't have to. "These dinners are for people who built careers," she said. Not quite to me, not quite to Daniel standing beside her. "His father has nothing in common with anyone here." I said nothing, then quieter. "One of the partners asked if you work here." "For the hotel." That one landed somewhere it shouldn't have. Daniel exhaled. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend her either. Let's just get through tonight, he said. Then, gentle, like he was doing me a favor. Dad, maybe after the speeches you head home. I nodded like he'd asked about the weather. Something in my chest went quiet. I told myself I'd leave the second dinner ended. Then the managing partner stood up, and nothing went the way any of us expected. His name was Richard Hale, 60, silver hair, a voice that fills a room without trying. He talked about growth, awards, a record year, ordinary things. Then he stopped, mid-sentence. I want to tell you something, he said, setting his notes down. It has nothing to do with tonight's numbers. The room went still, the way rooms do for a man who never stops mid-sentence. 22 years ago, a stranger changed my life. A few polite smiles. Nobody understood yet. He was an electrician. Now people leaned in. I never learned his name, but I've never forgotten the address, even after all these years. He was 28 that year. Every bank in the city already owned a piece of him. The office was cheap, old. The radiator worked when it wanted to. The fire inspector had already scheduled it for closure the next morning. His wife was 7 months pregnant. There was no plan B, just failure, and a baby coming into it. One night during a storm, the lights failed. Smoke came from inside a wall. The landlord said it wasn't his. Problem until morning. Morning would have been too late. An electrician showed up instead, alone, no van. No name on his shirt, just a toolbox and a flashlight. Richard remembered pacing behind him for hours. Useless. Watching a stranger pull back one panel after another, tracing a fault that kept hiding deeper into the wall every time it seemed close. 2 hours in, the man found a section of wiring so old it had been condemned twice already and never replaced. 3 hours in, sparks jumped from a junction box he'd just opened, close enough that Richard flinched. The electrician didn't. He worked in near silence except for the humming, low, steady. 3 or 4 bars of the same hymn over and over, like a metronome for his hands. Near sunrise, he found it, one spark away from taking the whole building down. When he finished, the young lawyer asked what he owed. The electrician looked around. Empty desks, second-hand chairs, boxes for filing cabinets, one client folder. Pay me after you win your first case, he said. Then he packed his tools and left before the sun was up. I owe this man more than my business, Richard said. He paused, long, enough that people started guessing. Money. A partnership. Some grand repayment. My daughter exists because of him, he said instead. If that office closed, we lost everything. My wife needed care that year we couldn't have afforded otherwise. I've never said that out loud. Until tonight. Then, I think he's in this room. 200 heads turned to look at each other, a nervous laugh. Someone thought it was a joke. Richard's eyes moved toward the front tables. Senior partners in tailored suits. One older man started to rise, smiling, already reaching for his jacket button. Richard shook his head. No, he said. Not you. The man sat back down, red-faced. The confusion sharpened into something else now. Curiosity. Richard's gaze kept moving. Past the partners, past the clients, all the way to the back wall, where the invisible people stand. He went quiet, listening. Somewhere near me. Silverware clinked against a plate, and underneath the noise of the room, so soft I almost hadn't caught myself doing it, I was humming. The same hymn. The one that steadies my hands when a job turns stubborn. I stopped myself. Too late. Richard was already looking at me. His eyes dropped to my hand, where my thumb had found the old burn scar and was rubbing it. the way I've done for 22 years whenever a room gets too quiet. He straightened. "Sir," he said into the microphone, "would you mind standing?" Every head turned. My chair scraped the floor as I rose, my knees stiffer than I remembered. "Did you once repair an office on Willow Street?" Richard asked, "and refuse to send an invoice?" The young man from that tiny office suddenly appeared inside the older face standing in front of me. "I might have," I said quietly. "It's you." More to himself than to the room, a few people laughed, still thinking it was some warm coincidence. Then the laughter died. Richard's face hadn't changed. This wasn't a bit. Daniel's confusion cracked into something else. Recognition, without understanding what he was recognizing yet. Victoria's hand rose slowly to her mouth. Richard walked straight across the ballroom, past the tables, past the orchestra, until he was standing in front of me. "I've been looking for you for 22 years. I didn't know what to say. I still don't. He turned back to the room. "Everything you see here exists because of a decision this man made on a night nobody was watching," he told them again. Slower this time, the scheduled closure, the savings that would have vanished, the child who would have been born into her father's ruin instead of his second chance. Then he looked past me, at Daniel, standing now, pale under the chandelier light. "Daniel, you've inherited this office." A pause. "Your father built it before either of us knew your name." Daniel looked at me as though he were seeing me for the first time. His mouth opened, closed again. Then, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked at my son. 40 years passed between us in that one look. "I thought raising a good lawyer was enough," I said. "I never thought I'd have to earn the right to be his father." Even the waiters stopped moving. Victoria didn't move either, hand pressed flat against her chest. No words came. What happened after surprised me more than the speech itself. Young associate came over first, "Hand out," asking how long I'd been an electrician. Then 2 more joined him. A woman from litigation asked if I'd speak to their new hires about quiet leadership. Her words. An older partner just shook my hand and said, "Thank you. No explanation needed." These were the same people who'd asked what firm I was with 2 hours earlier. Daniel watched all of it from a few feet away, saying very little, like a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the person who raised him. Every handshake I received seemed to land on him too, a small correction to some ledger he hadn't known he was keeping. Victoria left the gala early, quietly. No goodbyes. She came to my house 3 days later instead. No audience this time. Just my porch. 2 cups of coffee going cold. "I spent years measuring people by their titles," she said, turning her cup slowly. "My father raised me that way. Status first, everything else second." She looked up. "I confused status with worth. It took a room full of strangers to show me what I should have seen just looking at you." "I already forgave you," I said. "Somewhere between the speech and this coffee." She went quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked. "Why forgive it so easily?" "Because bitterness is heavier than any toolbox I ever carried," I said. "I stopped carrying it a long time ago." She smiled. For the first time, it looked real. A few weeks later, Daniel drove out to see me. I was in the garage, the way I always am on Saturdays, going through the old toolbox out of habit more than need. He found me in the bottom drawer, the one I hadn't opened in years. Underneath the wire cutters and spare fuses, papers, dozens of them. He pulled the first one out slowly. An invoice from 1987, unpaid, a widow's name at the top. Then another, a church that couldn't afford new wiring in '94. Then another, a single mother's apartment, a youth center, a bakery that didn't survive its first winter anyway, a fire station that never had a working generator. Until I gave it one. He kept going. A community pool closed for 2 summers until I rewired the pump house for nothing. A tenant building where I replaced every breaker box floor by floor over one long winter. never billing the landlord who'd already spent his last dollar on the roof. He read each one like a letter, slow, like he didn't want to miss a word. Near the bottom, he found one dated the same month he was born. A hospital wing. No name attached. At all. Just a note in my own handwriting. No charge. Ever. Did Mom know? He finally asked. I smiled. She did. That's why she never complained when I came home late. He sat there a long while, invoices spread across his knees, saying nothing. The Gala wasn't the only time you did this, he said. Not a question. It was just the only time anyone found out. He gathered the papers carefully. The way you'd handle, something you'd only just realized was valuable. Set them back inside the box, closed the lid himself, picked it up before I could stop him. His fingers slid under the same worn handle mine had smoothed down over 40 years. You've carried this long enough, Dad, he said. We walked out of the garage together, into the late afternoon light. For the first time in a long time, my son wasn't walking ahead of me. He was walking beside me, the toolbox between us, carrying his half without being asked. If you've ever given everything to a family that only saw your worth when a stranger pointed it out for them, I hope you'll tell someone below what that felt like. Not the argument, the moment. If someone in your life has been quietly carrying more than anyone ever noticed, I hope you'll tell them tonight, before a room full of strangers has to do it for you. And if you've ever felt invisible to the very people you built a life for, I need you to hear this. Someone has always seen what you carried. Sometimes they're just slower to say it.